Welcome to the Retire with Peace podcast, the podcast where we help you create a fulfilling and stress-free retirement. Each week, we bring you expert advice, practical tips, and inspiring stories to help you plan and live your best retirement life. Whether you're nearing retirement or already enjoying your golden years, this podcast is here to support you every step of the way. Let's embark on this journey together and discover how to retire with peace.
Welcome back to the Retire with Peace podcast. As always, I'm your host, Dave Zaegel, and we're going to start a series on inherited IRAs. So we'll have a handful of videos going over the details on inherited IRAs because there are new rules in place. And actually, the rules were first established back in 2019. They changed from being a stretch IRA to having set periods of time to withdraw the money, and we'll get into all that. But it took 5 years from that time to finally get the official regulations and guidance from the IRS. So now we have all that. It's going to go into effect in 2025. Therefore, I want to make sure everybody understands what's going on, what the rules are, what some of the not penalties, but downsides and benefits are, and how to plan accordingly for people that might inherit money from you. So first, in this episode, I want to go over what different types of beneficiaries there are. There's 3 different types. We'll cover each one. But first, let's back up a little bit and do some history. It used to be that when you inherited an IRA, you had to take required distributions, but you were able to stretch that over the rest of your expected life. Well, back in 2019, they passed the Secure Act 1.0. A couple of years later, they passed Secure Act 2.0 that updated some of those rules and clarified a lot of things. And then after that, the IRS came out with all of their guidance, which took a couple of years of back and forth for that. But it all started back in 2019 when the Secure Act was passed, and no longer can we stretch IRA withdrawals when we inherit the IRA. Now we are confined to a 10-year window in most cases. Sometimes it's a little bit shorter, and there are some exceptions to the 10-year window, very limited exceptions that we will talk about. But that's the background, and that's why we're going over it, because 2025 is the first year that these rules really kick in to where you have to take a required distribution. For several years, because we didn't know what the final guidance was or what exactly how to calculate things, now that the IRS has given us this guidance, we have to start taking it. Whereas before they said there's no penalty for not taking it because we haven't given official guidance yet. So that period of time in which we are not required to take the distributions is gone. We're into 2025, and now we need to know what the heck these inherited IRA beneficiaries are and how to take the money out and calculate it properly. So to start with, in this episode, we want to cover the 3 types of beneficiaries because it's important to know where you fall in one of those 3 types. If you inherit money, then we can talk about how to calculate it. So first type is called non-designated beneficiary, NDB for short, non-designated beneficiary. So this is anyone who's not an individual. So if you think about leaving it to an estate, leaving it to charity, putting it in a trust, most types of trust, there's different types, but generally this is where it's not your spouse, it's not your child, it's not your grandchild, it's not even a person, it's some other entity. And unfortunately, we'll see this a lot where people didn't name a beneficiary, so it winds up in their estate. You don't want to be in this category because there's really not a whole lot of benefits. If the owner of the original IRA dies before they have to start taking required distributions, now instead of a 10-year window, you're shrunk down to 5. You have to start taking those distributions and you have 5 years to take them out. So all of the traditional IRA withdrawals you'll have will get added to your taxable income. So this is great. You got the inheritance. That's awesome. But you might not be in the most ideal tax situation now because you're having to withdraw this money because a specific beneficiary wasn't named. It all went to the estate. And now you have 5 years over which to take the money out. There's not a required distribution each year in this case, but you only have 5 years, and that can cause quite a tax hit. Whereas if they just named you as a beneficiary instead, you'd be able to spread this out much longer. So, key point number one, please name a beneficiary on your IRA accounts. It's not hard to do. It's usually a pretty quick and easy form to fill out because if you leave money that just goes to an estate, well, it's not a very favorable rules for anybody. So if you're wanting to leave money to somebody, help them out, name them as a beneficiary. If you just leave it to the estate and let the judges and lawyers figure it out, not only is that a mess, but the person inheriting the money has a much shorter time period over which to take it out, and that's not much fun. Now, if you leave it to charity, it doesn't matter because it's not taxable to a charity. So fine, that's fine. You can name a charity as a beneficiary on an IRA. It's actually a pretty tax efficient way to get money to the charity because the charity does not pay taxes. So that's fine. But just understand that if you're not leaving it to a charity and you're trying to leave it to somebody specifically, name them as a beneficiary. It's going to help tremendously. Otherwise, they wind up in this non designated beneficiary category with no benefits whatsoever. One last thing on this category, which it tricks a lot of people up because we talked about if they haven't attained their required minimum distribution date yet. So if the original owner, let's say they're 65 years old, they're not required to take distributions from their IRA yet, and they pass it on to this non-designated beneficiary. Now we've started the 5-year window over which the people that inherited the money have to take the money. Now, let's say that they are 76 years old and they've started taking required distributions already. Now you're not actually confined to this 5-year rule. You're actually, you have to take it out over that deceased person's remaining expected life. Now, that's not so bad. It can get a little bit tricky because in this example, we're talking about age 76, I believe I said. So you could actually produce a situation where now you're allowed to take it out over a 10-year time, more than a 10-year time period, because their expected life is longer than 10 years. So you can think, oh, that's great. They have a much longer expected life. We can stretch this out. And yes, that's true. You got lucky. That's absolutely the case. But let's flip this a little bit and say, okay, they were 94 and they passed away and did not specify a beneficiary. Their life expectancy isn't that long. You're going to have to pull it out even faster. So there's some windows of time where maybe you could benefit a little bit. Maybe this could be really bad from a tax perspective. Point being, name a beneficiary. Don't leave it to this non-designated beneficiary category unless you're specifically wanting to give it to a charity, which is fine. No problems there. Just make sure you specify that charity properly. They can get the money. There's no tax to them. But either way, name a beneficiary, make life easy for everybody. It's easy to do. So that's the first category, is non-designated beneficiary. Second one is non-eligible designated beneficiary. Okay, so the first one was non-designated beneficiary. The second one is non-eligible designated beneficiary. This one's relatively straightforward because you can think of it as adult children and grandchildren. Very typical for family members to inherit money. If they're adults, they fall into this category. Now, if the owner dies before their required beginning date for their required distributions, there's no annual required distribution for you as the person that inherited the money. But you still have to take it out over that 10-year period. So now, at least in this scenario, if they died before they had to take required distributions, you can plan out when you might want to take them over that 10-year period, but still know that you're limited to that 10-year period. If the original owner of the IRA dies after they were required to take distributions from their IRA, now you have to take required distributions each year in that 10-year window, and you're still limited to that 10 years that you must take it out over. So we're going to talk a little bit more later about why we try not to leave too much in traditional IRAs as an inheritance versus Roth IRAs, because now In a lot of cases, we'll see adult children inheriting money when they themselves are in some of their highest earnings years, which is fine. So now they are in higher tax brackets and they're adding this inheritance money on top of that and even higher tax brackets. Again, they're inheriting money. That's not so bad, but they're having to pay an awful lot more tax. If we could have done some more planning, if they could have inherited maybe a piece that's traditional IRA, piece that's Roth IRA, not taxable, that could have really helped them. So we're going to come back to some planning in later episodes, but for now, we're just talking about the beneficiary types. So in this case, we're talking adult children, grandchildren. They're called non-eligible designated beneficiaries. They're subject to that 10-year window, and whether or not they have to take required distributions in that 10-year window depends on whether or not you attained the age of required distributions yet or not. So if you're not taking required distributions, then the beneficiaries are not required to distribute annually. They just have to take it over 10 years. If you started your required distributions, now they must take distributions annually. We're going to get into the calculation on that in the next episode. Now, the third category, this is premium seating, first class, however you want to describe it. These are called eligible designated beneficiaries. Okay, so these are long names, but think about it. The first one was non-designated beneficiary. Those are there's not much benefit to being in that crowd. Name the beneficiary, please. So non-designated beneficiary was the first one. The second one is non-eligible but designated beneficiary. And now the third one is eligible designated beneficiary. So these are surviving spouses. That's easy. You can just take the money from your spouse that passed away, move it into your IRA account, and there's no extra requirements there. You can just move it from one to the other. Minor children. So minor children of an account owner until they reach age 21. So you could have a case where, say, the person inheriting is 16 years old. So for those first 5 years, they're not subject to any of the required distribution rules. But once they hit 21, they are. That can be a little bit tricky. But just know that for now, they fall into that eligible designated beneficiary world where they're not having to be subject to the 10-year window right away. They're not having to take required distributions. And it's just a nice place to be. So if you're naming beneficiaries, this can work well if you are a surviving spouse, minor child. It can also work for disabled individuals, chronically ill, and individuals that are not more than 10 years younger than the IRA owner. Now, this can get a little bit tricky. So we're not going to talk too much about disabled and chronically ill because there's actually a pretty high standard to meet for that. There's some court cases where people tried to say that they were disabled or something and the court tossed it out. You really have to be pretty sick or pretty disabled. So most people are not going to fall in that category. We're not even going to talk about that too much. Now let's talk about individuals that are not more than 10 years younger than the IRA owner. So this can be a situation where it could be siblings leaving money to each other, to where one sibling maybe was 48 years old and now they are leaving money to a couple of other siblings, but one of them happens to be 28 years old. So they're 20 years younger. They're not going to fall into this eligible designated beneficiary category because they are more than 10 years younger than the person that passed away. It's a goofy little wrinkle, not something that we want to go too much into detail on this video, but just know that the eligible designated beneficiary is the best place to be. That's first class, premium seating, all the good stuff. It exempts you from the 10-year rule because it's a surviving spouse, an adult child or grandchild generally, or there's special rules for disabled and chronically ill. Now, one of the interesting points is you could actually elect, if you're an eligible designated beneficiary, you could actually elect to take the 10-year rule. Now, people would say, why in the world would you ever elect to take the 10-year distribution if you don't have to at all? Well, the simple answer is, let's say you're a surviving spouse. and your spouse passed away when they were 51. And now you might need the money from the traditional IRA. Well, let's say your spouse was 51 and you're 49. If that money is inherited and moved over to you into your IRA, a lot of people would say, great, it's moved over, no distributions needed, awesome, clean. And that is most cases what happens. But if you're moving that money just over to your IRA from your spouse's IRA that passed away, you can't access that money until you're 59 and a half without paying a penalty. But if you need that money, you can elect the 10-year rule and start taking withdrawals, and you're not going to be penalized. You're not going to have that 10% early IRA withdrawal penalty. So there is a situation where you might say, I need that money. I need to elect the 10-year rule. And therefore, that we just need you to know that that is available to you. But if you don't need the money, you can roll it over from your spouse that passed away right into your account. No penalty, no required distribution, nothing. I know that was probably a lot of details, but it's important to understand the three types of beneficiaries before we get into some more of the calculations and planning pieces. But the big point here is please name a beneficiary. That way they don't end up in this non-designated beneficiary world of a mess trying to figure out, did you attain the required distribution age or not, or it's going to the estate and who's going to get it because it went to the estate, and it's a mess. Don't do it. Name a beneficiary, make everybody's life easier. But otherwise, if you're not in that non-designated beneficiary world, you're going to fall into one of two camps. You're going to fall into the non-eligible designated beneficiary, which is typically adult children and grandchildren, or you're going to fall into the designated eligible designated beneficiary, which is typically surviving spouses and minor children. So just understand those three categories and what the rules are for each. Next time, we're going to talk about the calculations and also some planning around getting money into Roth IRAs, so that way we don't have to mess with quite as many of these rules.